The morning sun barely touched the grand entrance of the Vienna Conservatory when the line of hopeful young musicians started forming. Some clutched violins, others carried music sheets rolled up tight in their sweaty palms. Parents whispered last-minute encouragement while their children tried to calm their racing hearts. Today was the day that could change everything. The annual scholarship audition only accepted 15 students out of hundreds who applied. For most families, this scholarship wasn't just an opportunity. It was the only way their children could ever afford to study at one of Europe's most prestigious music schools. Inside the main auditorium, Maestro Friedrich Wagner was doing what he'd done every year for the past 40 years. He arranged his notes, adjusted his reading glasses, and made sure the judging panel had everything they needed. Wagner wasn't just any music teacher. He was a legend in classical music circles. Concert halls across 3 continents knew his name. But what made him truly special, or so everyone said, was his warmth. While other maestros were known for being harsh and critical, Wagner had built his reputation on encouragement. He smiled at nervous students. He found something positive to say even when performances fell short. Young musicians left his presence feeling inspired, not crushed. That's what the newspapers wrote about him. That's what parents told their children. That's what Wagner himself believed. Around mid-morning, after hearing a dozen competent but unremarkable performances, Wagner noticed something unusual. A woman was helping a young girl up the auditorium steps. The girl, who looked about 12 years old, wore a simple blue dress and held her mother's arm with one hand. In her other hand, she carried nothing. No instrument case. No sheet music, nothing. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the black silk blindfold tied around her head. Wagner's welcoming smile flickered for just a moment. He'd seen a lot in his 4 decades of teaching. Students who froze mid-performance. Children who forgot their pieces entirely. Even one boy who fainted from nerves before playing a single note. But a blindfold? That was new. He exchanged a quick glance with the other 2 judges sitting beside him. One raised an eyebrow. The other shrugged slightly. The girl's mother, a thin woman with worry lines etched deep around her eyes, helped her daughter to the piano bench. She adjusted the seat height and whispered something in the girl's ear. Then she turned to address the panel. "Good morning, Maestro Wagner. My daughter is Elena Kovacs. She'll be performing today with the blindfold on. I hope that's acceptable." Wagner's smile was already gone, but he tried to keep his voice level. Professional. "Miss Kovacs, while we appreciate creativity, this is a classical music audition, not a theatrical performance. We evaluate talent here, not showmanship." His words came out sharper than he intended. Around him, the few parents waiting for their children's turns shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the warm Maestro Wagner they'd read about. Elena's mother opened her mouth to respond, but Elena herself spoke first. Her voice was soft but steady. "Sir, I'm not trying to show off. I just play better this way. May I begin?" Something in her tone made Wagner pause. There was no defiance there. No teenage rebellion or attention-seeking attitude. Just a simple statement of fact. He waved his hand dismissively. "Very well, proceed. But I should warn you that gimmicks, however well-intentioned, rarely impress this panel." The other judges nodded in agreement. One even made a note on his score sheet before Elena had played a single note. Wagner settled back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest. His smile was completely gone now, replaced by a tight line of barely concealed irritation. In his mind, he was already preparing the gentle but firm rejection speech he'd give this family afterward. Something about respecting the audition process, about the difference between genuine talent and publicity stunts. Elena positioned herself on the bench. Her small fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment. Then she announced her piece. Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor by Rachmaninoff. Wagner actually laughed. Not a kind laugh. A sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed through the auditorium. One of the other judges covered his mouth to hide his own amusement. Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto wasn't just difficult. It was brutally, punishingly complex. Professional pianists spent years mastering it. The piece demanded enormous handspans, incredible finger independence, and the kind of emotional depth that usually only came with age and experience. For a 12-year-old to attempt it was ambitious. For a blindfolded 12-year-old to attempt it seemed almost insulting to the composer's memory. "Miss Kovacs," Wagner said, his voice dripping with condescension he'd never used before, Perhaps you'd like to choose something more age-appropriate? A Mozart sonata, perhaps? Something that would actually showcase your abilities rather than highlight your limitations? Elena's mother looked like she wanted to say something, but again, Elena answered for herself. I'd like to play this piece, please. Wagner sighed heavily and made a show of looking at his watch. Very well. But we do have quite a few more students to hear today, so if you could keep it to just the first movement, we'd appreciate it. What he didn't say, but everyone in the room understood, was that he expected this to be over quickly. A few bars of stumbling notes, a polite golf clap, and they could all move on. Elena nodded once. She took a breath. Then her fingers touched the keys. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece filled the auditorium. And within 5 seconds, every single assumption in Wagner's mind began to crumble. Her left hand moved with impossible precision, laying down the deep, sonorous bass line that anchors the entire piece. Her right hand danced across the higher registers, each note crystal clear and perfectly timed. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, no sense that she couldn't see the keys in front of her. Wagner's arms slowly uncrossed. He leaned forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open. Beside him, the other judges had stopped writing entirely. Their pens hung frozen above their score sheets. Elena's body swayed with the music, moving as if the piano were an extension of herself. When the piece demanded soft, gentle passages, her touch was feather-light. When it called for power and drama, her small hands somehow produced thunderous chords that vibrated through the floor. She navigated the rapid runs and complex chord progressions that made even experienced pianists nervous, and she did it all without seeing a single key. But it wasn't just technical perfection. That alone would have been impressive enough. What made Wagner's chest tighten was the emotion. This child, this blindfolded 12-year-old girl, was playing with the kind of deep, mature understanding that shouldn't have been possible. She understood the piece's longing, its passion, its moments of quiet despair and soaring hope. Every phrase was shaped with intention. Every dynamic choice made sense. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story. The few parents in the audience sat motionless, afraid that even breathing too loud might break the spell. Elena's mother had tears streaming down her face, but she made no sound. And Wagner, the legendary Maestro who'd heard thousands of auditions, who'd judged competitions across the world, who thought he'd seen every kind of talent imaginable, felt something he rarely experienced. He felt small. He felt wrong. And most disturbing of all, he felt afraid of what it might mean. Elena's fingers flew across the keys, building toward the first movement's powerful climax. The music swelled, filling every corner of the auditorium with sound that seemed too big to come from such a small person. Her hands stretched across the keyboard, hitting chord progressions that required reaches most children her age simply couldn't make. Yet she made it look effortless, natural, like breathing. Wagner's heart pounded in his chest. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Students didn't walk into auditions and play like this. Not at 12 years old. Not blindfolded. Not without years of study at an institution exactly like the one he ran. Where had this child come from? Who had taught her? And why? Why had he been so quick to dismiss her? The other judges weren't faring much better. The woman to Wagner's left, a stern viola professor who rarely showed emotion during auditions, had both hands pressed against her mouth. The man on his right, a pianist himself, was shaking his head slowly back and forth as if he couldn't quite believe what his ears were telling him. Behind them, the small audience of waiting families had gone completely still. Even the youngest children, who usually fidgeted and whispered, sat frozen in their seats. Elena reached the final phrases of the movement. Her playing softened, the thunderous chords giving way to gentle, almost fragile notes that seemed to float in the air. She held the final chord, letting it ring out until it faded into absolute silence. Then she lifted her hands from the keys and placed them carefully in her lap. Her chest rose and fell with deep breaths. Sweat glistened on her forehead, just visible beneath the edge of the blindfold. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched on for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. It was the kind of silence that happens when something so unexpected occurs that the human brain needs extra time to process it. Wagner stared at the girl sitting calmly at the piano. Her face turned slightly toward where she knew the judges were sitting, even though she couldn't see them. Finally, Wagner found his voice. Or something like it. The word came out as barely more than a whisper. How? Elena tilted her head, confused by the question. How, sir? Wagner stood up from his seat. His legs felt unsteady beneath him. He walked toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The other judges watched him, uncertain what was happening. Wagner never approached students during auditions. He always maintained professional distance. But nothing about this situation felt normal anymore. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage, walking slowly toward Elena. She turned her head slightly, tracking his movement by sound. Up close, Wagner could see her more clearly. She was small for 12, with thin wrists and delicate fingers that seemed too fragile to produce the powerful music he'd just heard. The black silk blindfold was tied neatly behind her head, a simple knot that her mother must have done for her that morning. "Miss Kovacs," Wagner said, his voice still shaky. "I need to understand something." That performance was extraordinary. Beyond extraordinary, but playing Rachmaninoff blindfolded, even if you've memorized the piece perfectly, requires knowing exactly where your hands are at all times. The slightest miscalculation, the tiniest error in distance, and the whole thing falls apart. "How did you do it?" Elena's face showed no pride, no smugness at having proven the famous Maestro wrong. She simply looked puzzled that he was asking. "I always play this way, sir. I've never played any other way." Something cold settled in Wagner's stomach. A terrible suspicion was forming in his mind. "What do you mean you've never played any other way?" "I mean, I've always used the blindfold when I practice. My teacher insisted on it from my very first lesson. She said it would help me develop a better connection with the music." Wagner's mouth went dry. "Your teacher made you practice blindfolded? From the beginning? That's a very unusual teaching method." Elena's mother suddenly stood up from where she'd been sitting in the front row. "Maestro Wagner, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Elena doesn't wear the blindfold as a teaching method. She wears it because I don't like people staring at my eyes." Elena interrupted quietly. "They make people uncomfortable. The blindfold is easier for everyone." Wagner felt like the floor was tilting beneath him. "I don't understand. What's wrong with your eyes?" For the first time since she'd sat down at the piano, Elena showed emotion. She hesitated, her hands clasping together in her lap. Her mother started to speak, but Elena shook her head slightly. "It's okay, Mama, I can tell him." She turned her face toward where Wagner stood, just a few feet away from her now. "Sir, would you like me to remove the blindfold?" Wagner nodded, then realized she couldn't see the gesture. "Yes, please." Elena reached up with both hands and slowly untied the knot at the back of her head. The silk fell away, and she carefully folded it and placed it on the piano bench beside her. Then she turned to face Wagner fully. The sound that came from the audience wasn't quite a gasp. It was something softer, a collective intake of breath, a moment of understanding that changed everything. Elena's eyes were open, but they weren't looking at Wagner. They weren't looking at anything. Her irises were clouded over, milky white with just the faintest hint of blue around the edges. They moved slightly as if searching for something they could never find. Because Elena Kovacs wasn't wearing a blindfold as a gimmick. She wasn't trying to make her performance more impressive or memorable. The blindfold was an act of kindness, a way to make other people more comfortable around her. Elena had been blind since the day she was born. Wagner took a step backward. His legs hit the piano bench and he sat down heavily, not on the bench but on the stage floor itself. He put his face in his hands. Around him he heard movement. The other judges standing up. Whispered conversations. Elena's mother climbing onto the stage. But it all seemed distant, muffled, like he was underwater. The woman judge spoke first, her voice tight with emotion. "Elena, that was the most beautiful performance I've heard in 20 years of judging auditions. The scholarship is yours, unanimously." The male judge agreed quickly. "Absolutely." Without question, but Wagner couldn't speak. He couldn't look up. Because in that moment, sitting on the stage floor of his own conservatory, he was no longer thinking about Elena. He was thinking about another audition, another blind musician, another time when he'd sat in judgment and made a decision that he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. Elena's mother helped Wagner to his feet. She was surprisingly gentle, given how he'd treated her daughter just minutes before. "Maestro, are you all right? Do you need water?" Wagner finally looked up at her. His face had gone pale.
"How long has she been blind?"
"Since birth. The doctor said her optic nerves never developed properly." "And she plays like this?" Without ever having seen a piano? Without ever having seen her own hands? Elena's mother smiled sadly. She plays like this because she's never seen a piano. Music is her way of seeing the world. It's the only way she knows. Wagner turned to look at Elena, who had put the blindfold back on. She sat quietly, waiting for whatever would happen next. This child had just played one of the most demanding pieces in classical piano literature, with technical perfection and emotional maturity that professional pianists spent lifetimes trying to achieve, and she'd done it without being able to see a single key, without any visual reference point, using only touch, memory, and a connection to music that Wagner was only beginning to understand. "Miss Kovac," he said, his voice barely steady, "I owe you an apology. I assumed things about you that were completely wrong. I was dismissive and rude, and you responded with grace and extraordinary talent. I am sorry." Elena nodded once, accepting his words. "Thank you, sir." But as Wagner walked back to his seat, as the next student was called to audition, as life in the conservatory continued its normal rhythm, one thought kept circling through his mind like a bird that couldn't find a place to land. 30 years ago, there had been another blind musician, another audition, another chance to say yes, and Wagner had said no. Wagner barely heard the rest of the auditions that day. Students came and went, playing their prepared pieces, some good and some mediocre. He nodded at the appropriate times. He made notes on his score sheet. He even smiled at a few of the more nervous children, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere 30 years in the past. When the last student finished, Wagner told the other judges he needed to review some files before they made their final decisions. It was a lie. The decisions were already made. Elena would receive the scholarship, along with 14 other talented students whose names were already circled on the list. But Wagner needed time alone. He needed to face something he'd been running from for 3 decades. His office was on the 3rd floor of the conservatory, down a long hallway lined with photographs of famous musicians who'd studied there. Wagner had walked this hallway thousands of times, but today each step felt heavy, difficult, like walking through deep water. He unlocked his door and closed it firmly behind him, turning the lock. He didn't want anyone interrupting what he was about to do. The filing cabinets along the back wall held records going back 50 years. Wagner kept everything, every audition, every acceptance letter, every rejection. He told himself it was for historical purposes, for the conservatory's archives. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was buried in the bottom drawer of the 3rd cabinet, in a folder he hadn't opened in almost 30 years. His hands shook as he pulled out the drawer. It stuck slightly, swollen from age and humidity. Inside, folders were arranged by year. He counted backward. 1995, 1994, 1993. There, 1992. His finger stopped on a thin folder marked with just a date and a number. Audition 247. He pulled it out and carried it to his desk. For a long moment, Wagner just stared at the folder. Opening it would mean confronting something he'd worked very hard to forget. Something he'd buried under 4 decades of good deeds and encouraging words and the reputation he'd built as the kind maestro who believed in young musicians. But Elna's performance had cracked something open inside him, something that had been sealed shut for too long. He opened the folder. Inside was an audition form yellowed with age. The handwriting was his own, though younger and neater than his current scrawl. At the top of the form was a name: Thomas Richter, age 17, instrument violin. And then, in the section marked Special Accommodations Requested, 3 words that Wagner had written himself: Student is blind. Wagner closed his eyes, but he couldn't stop the memories from flooding back. Thomas had been thin, gangly, all elbows and nervous energy. His mother had helped him onto the stage, just like Ellie. Ina's mother had done today. Thomas had been wearing dark glasses instead of a blindfold, but the effect was the same. Everyone in the auditorium had known immediately that something was different about this boy. Wagner remembered his own reaction. He'd been younger then, only 35, already making a name for himself but still hungry to prove he belonged among Europe's musical elite. He'd looked at Thomas and seen complications, special needs, extra work for the faculty, questions about whether the conservatory's facilities could accommodate a blind student, and underneath all those practical concerns was something Wagner had never wanted to admit to: Himself, fear that accepting a disabled student might lower the conservatory's standards in the eyes of other prestigious institutions. Thomas had played Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the Winter Movement. Wagner could still remember it perfectly, even though 3 decades had passed. The boy's playing had been raw, not as polished as it should have been. His technique showed gaps in his training, but there was something there, a spark, a natural musicality that teachers can't create, they can only nurture. Thomas played with feeling that went beyond technical perfection. He played like someone who understood that music wasn't just sound. It was communication, connection, a language that needed no eyes to speak or understand. After Thomas finished, the 4 judges on the panel that year had discussed his audition. 3 of them wanted to accept him. They saw the potential. They were willing to work with his limitations. But there was one dissenting vote. One person who argued that the conservatory wasn't equipped to handle a blind student. That Thomas would require modifications to the curriculum that would be unfair to other students. That accepting him would be setting him up for failure rather than success. That one dissenting vote had been Wagner's. He'd been eloquent in his arguments, persuasive. He'd made it sound like he was protecting Thomas, protecting the institution, protecting everyone. And in the end, his opinion had carried the most weight because even then his reputation mattered. The other judges had reluctantly agreed. Thomas was rejected. Wagner pulled another document from the folder. It was a newspaper clipping printed on paper so old it was brittle to the touch. The headline read, "Young musician dies in apartment fire." The article was brief. Thomas Richter, age 19, had died in his apartment when a faulty space heater started a fire. He'd been trying to save money on heating bills. He'd been working 3 part-time jobs trying to afford private music lessons, trying to save enough money to audition somewhere else, anywhere that would give him a chance. The article mentioned that Thomas had been blind. It mentioned that he'd been rejected from several prestigious music schools. It didn't mention Wagner by name. It didn't need to. Wagner knew his role in the story. He'd known it for 30 years. After Thomas's death, Wagner had changed, or at least he'd tried to change. He'd become the encouraging teacher, the one who gave students second chances, the one who smiled and found something positive to say, even when performances fell short. He'd built an entire reputation on being kind, on believing in young musicians, on giving opportunities to those who needed them most. But it had all been an attempt to balance the scales, to make up for the one time he'd let his fear and prejudice win, and until today, he'd almost convinced himself that he'd succeeded. That the kind Maestro Wagner was the real Wagner, and the man who'd rejected Thomas Richter was just a young, misguided version of himself that no longer existed. Elena had shown him the truth. The man who'd rejected Thomas was still there, still inside him. That same man had looked at a blindfolded girl and immediately assumed she was showing off, had been dismissive and condescending, had nearly made the same mistake twice 30 years apart because he'd never actually changed. He'd just gotten better at hiding. Wagner put his head down on the desk, the folder still open in front of him. His shoulders shook. He'd cried only a handful of times in his adult life, and always in private. But now the tears came, hot and bitter, for a boy he'd failed and for the lie he'd been living ever since. There was a soft knock at his door. Wagner quickly wiped his eyes and cleared his throat. "Yes, Maestro, it's getting late. The other judges are waiting to finalize the scholarship decisions." It was his assistant's voice, patient and professional. Wagner looked at his watch. 2 hours had passed. He'd been sitting here, drowning in memory and regret, for 2 entire hours. "I'll be right there," he called out. He carefully put the documents back in the folder and returned it to the filing cabinet. But he left the drawer open. He wasn't going to hide from this anymore. He couldn't. Not after today. Walking back to the conference room where the other judges waited, Wagner made a decision. It was probably the most important decision of his career, more important than any performance he'd ever given, more important than any student he'd ever taught. He was going to tell the truth, not just to himself this time, to everyone. 2 weeks passed before the scholarship announcement ceremony. Those 14 days felt like the longest of Wagner's life. He went through the motions of teaching his classes, attending faculty meetings, and preparing for the event. But inside, he was rehearsing something else entirely. the speech he needed to give, the truth he needed to tell. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Wagner was quieter than usual, more distracted. When the dean asked if he was feeling well, Wagner just nodded and said he was fine. But he wasn't fine. He was terrified, because what he was about to do would destroy the reputation he'd spent 40 years building, and he knew that some people would never forgive him for it. The ceremony was held in the conservatory's largest concert hall. Families filled the seats dressed in their best clothes. Some had traveled from other countries for this moment. Scholarship announcements were always big events, but this year felt different. Word had spread about a remarkable blind girl who'd played Rachmaninoff blindfolded. Local newspapers had called asking for interviews. A few music journalists had shown up, cameras in hand. Wagner stood backstage wearing his formal conducting suit. His hands trembled as he adjusted his tie for the third time. The dean stood beside him, reviewing the program. We'll have the orchestra play first. Then you'll announce the scholarship winners, say a few words about excellence and dedication, the usual. Should take about 20 minutes total. Simple and dignified, just how we like it. I need to make a change to the program, Wagner said quietly. The dean looked up from his notes. What kind of change? Friedrich, we've already printed the programs. I need more time to speak. There's something I have to say. Something important. The dean frowned. The families are here to learn about the scholarships, not to hear a lengthy speech. Can't whatever you want to say wait for the faculty meeting next week? No, Wagner said firmly. It can't wait. Not another day. Not another hour. Something in Wagner's voice made the dean pause. They'd worked together for 15 years, and he'd never heard Wagner sound quite like this. Desperate, determined, almost frightened. All right, the dean said slowly. But Friedrich, please remember this is a celebration. Keep it appropriate. Wagner nodded, though he knew that what he was about to do would be anything but a typical celebration speech. The orchestra played beautifully. Mozart and Handel, pieces that showcased the conservatory's excellence. When they finished, the dean took the microphone and welcomed everyone. He talked about the conservatory's proud history, its commitment to nurturing young talent, and its gratitude to the donors who made the scholarships possible. Then he introduced Wagner. The applause was warm and genuine. Wagner was beloved here. Students and families trusted him, respected him. As he walked to the center of the stage, he saw Elena sitting in the front row with her mother. She wore a light green dress and no blindfold. Her clouded eyes looked toward the sound of the applause, but couldn't see the hundreds of people filling the hall. Wagner cleared his throat and pulled out his prepared speech. The one listing the scholarship winners, praising their dedication, offering words of encouragement. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it and put it back in his pocket. Before I announce this year's scholarship recipients, he began, his voice echoing through the hall, I need to tell you a story. Some of you might find it uncomfortable. All of you will probably find it disappointing. But I've learned recently that the truth matters more than comfort, more than reputation, more than pride. The audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't the usual ceremony opening. Parents exchanged confused glances. The dean, standing in the wings, looked alarmed. 30 years ago, Wagner continued, I was part of a scholarship panel much like the one that judged this year's auditions. A young man auditioned on violin. His name was Thomas Richter. He was 17 years old and he was blind. Elena's mother sat up straighter in her seat. She reached over and took her daughter's hand. Thomas played well, not perfectly. His technique had gaps. He'd been learning from whoever would teach him, piecing together his education however he could. But he had something special. A natural gift for music that teachers can't create, only help develop. 3 of the 4 judges on the panel that year wanted to PT him. They saw his potential. They were willing to work with him, to help him grow into the musician he could become. Wagner paused. The hall was completely silent now. Even the journalists had stopped taking photos. But there was one judge who disagreed, one person who argued that Thomas would be too difficult to accommodate, that accepting a blind student would require special modifications that might lower our standards, that it would be unfair to Thomas himself to accept him into a program that wasn't designed for someone with his disability. Wagner's voice cracked slightly. He gripped the microphone stand to steady himself. That one judge was me, and because my opinion carried weight even then, Thomas was rejected. He never got another opportunity like that one. He died 2 years later, at 19 years old, Still working multiple jobs to try to afford music lessons. Still trying to save enough money to audition somewhere else. Still hoping that someone somewhere would give him a chance. Gasps rippled through the audience. The dean had gone pale. Some parents covered their mouths in shock. But Wagner kept going. He couldn't stop now, even if he wanted to. I've spent the last 30 years trying to make up for that decision. I became the encouraging teacher. The one who always found something positive to say. The one who gave students second chances. I told myself I'd changed. That I'd learned from my mistake. That the kind Maestro Wagner was the real me. And the man who rejected Thomas was just a young, foolish version that no longer existed. Wagner looked directly at Elena, though she couldn't see him looking. But 2 weeks ago, a 12-year-old girl walked into our audition wearing a blindfold, and my very first reaction was irritation. Dismissiveness. I assumed she was showing off. I was condescending and rude. I nearly made the same mistake twice 3 decades apart because I never actually changed. I just got better at hiding who I really was. Elena's mother was crying now, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of anger. They were something else, something more complicated. Elena Kovacs played the most beautiful Rachmaninoff I've ever heard. She did it without being able to see a single key. She did it with grace and humility, even after I'd been unkind to her. And she showed me that I've been living a lie, that all my kind words and encouraging smiles over the past 30 years were just my way of not facing what I'd done, of not admitting that I let my fear and prejudice destroy a young man's future. The hall was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Wagner's own breath came in shaky gasps. I can't bring Thomas back. I can't give him the career he deserved. But I can do 2 things. First, I can tell the truth, all of it. Not just to myself this time, but to all of you. To Elena and her mother. To every student who's ever trusted me. The kind Maestro Wagner was built on a foundation of guilt and shame. And that's not good enough anymore. He pulled a piece of paper from his other pocket. His hand shook as he unfolded it. Second, I'm announcing the creation of the Thomas Richter Memorial Fund. This fund will provide full scholarships specifically for disabled musicians who face barriers to musical education. It will be funded initially by my personal savings, and I'm asking anyone who believes in second chances, in real change instead of just good intentions, to contribute. Wagner looked out at the sea of faces. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry. Some, like Elena's mother, looked sad and moved and maybe, just maybe, a little bit hopeful. I know this doesn't fix what I did. Nothing can fix it. But maybe, if we help enough young musicians like Thomas, like Elena, we can make sure that fear and prejudice don't steal any more futures. That's all I have to say. He set down the microphone and walked off the stage. He didn't announce the scholarship winners. He didn't give the encouraging closing remarks. He just walked away, past the stunned dean, past his shocked colleagues, out into the hallway where he finally let himself collapse against the wall and cry for the second time in 30 years. The backlash came swiftly. By the next morning, Wagner's confession was in every major newspaper in Vienna. Some articles were sympathetic, praising his honesty and courage. Others were brutal, calling him a hypocrite who'd built a career on a lie. Several prominent alumni wrote angry letters demanding his resignation. A few donors threatened to pull their funding from the conservatory. The board of directors held emergency meetings behind closed doors, discussing what to do about their suddenly controversial director. Wagner expected all of this. What he didn't expect was the knock on his office door 3 days after the ceremony. He'd been packing his things, assuming his resignation would be requested at any moment. When he opened the door, Elena stood there with her mother. Miss Kovacs, Wagner said, surprised. I didn't know you were coming today. Elena's mother smiled gently. We asked the dean if we could speak with you. He said you'd probably want to see us. Wagner stepped aside to let them in. Elena used her white cane to navigate around his half-packed boxes, finding the chair across from his desk with practiced ease. Her mother sat beside her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Wagner didn't know where to begin. How do you apologize to someone for nearly repeating the mistake that destroyed another person's life? What words could possibly be enough? Elena broke the silence. Maestro Wagner, I wanted to thank you. Wagner blinked in confusion. Thank me? Elena, I was rude to you. I assumed terrible things about you before you even played a note. If anything, I owe you an apology. You already apologized, Elena said simply. At the audition and again at the ceremony. But that's not what I'm thanking you for. I'm thanking you for telling the truth about Thomas. Her mother nodded. Do you know how many people with disabilities face the same kind of discrimination that Thomas faced? The same assumptions that their needs are too complicated, too expensive, too much work? It happens every day in every field, not just music. But people rarely admit it. They hide behind polite excuses. They say it's about standards or resources or what's best for everyone. You told the truth. That matters more than you know. Wagner felt his throat tighten. But I'm the reason Thomas never got his chance. If I'd voted differently, if I'd been braver, less concerned about what other people thought, then Thomas might have had a different life, Elena interrupted. Or he might not have. We can't know. But what we do know is that right now, because of what you said, people are talking. About accessibility, about giving disabled musicians real opportunities, about examining their own biases instead of pretending those biases don't exist. Elena's mother pulled out a folder from her bag. We've been receiving messages, dozens of them, from parents of disabled children who want to study music, from musicians who gave up on their dreams because they couldn't find schools that would accept them, from teachers who want to know how they can do better. Your memorial fund announcement has already raised over 50,000 euros in donations. Wagner sat down heavily in his chair. He'd set up the fund with his own savings, expecting it might help one or two students. He hadn't imagined this kind of response. But the conservatory's reputation, Wagner said weakly. The board is furious with me. Some of the faculty won't even speak to me anymore. Some of them won't, Elena's mother agreed. But others are, asking important questions they should have asked years ago, like why the conservatory has never had wheelchair ramps at the side entrances, or why there's no assistive technology in the practice rooms, or why they've never actively recruited disabled students despite claiming to value diversity. Elena leaned forward. Maestro Wagner, I've been blind my whole life. I've heard every excuse, every kind rejection, every promise that maybe next year or at a different school or when we're better equipped. What you did was acknowledge that those excuses are often just fear dressed up as practicality. That's rare, and it's valuable. Wagner looked at this remarkable young woman, this child who played Rachmaninoff like a master and showed more grace than he'd earned. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Elena. What I did to Thomas isn't about me to forgive, Elena said quietly. That's between you and Thomas, or between you and yourself, since Thomas isn't here anymore. But what you do next, that's about all of us. Every disabled person who's ever been told they're too complicated, too expensive, too much work. Her mother pulled out another document. The dean sent us this. He wanted us to give it to you personally. She handed it across the desk. Wagner unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was a proposal, a detailed plan for making the conservatory fully accessible. Ramps and elevators, Braille music notation resources, assistive technology for the practice rooms, a dedicated admissions counselor for disabled applicants, and at the bottom, a note in the dean's handwriting. The board approved the budget this morning. We need you to help us implement this properly. Please don't resign. They want me to stay? Wagner whispered. Not everyone, Elena's mother admitted, but enough people, enough to matter. The dean said you've spent 30 years trying to make up for one terrible decision by being kind to everyone except yourself. Maybe it's time to try something different. Over the next 3 years, the conservatory changed in ways Wagner never imagined possible. The accessibility renovations were just the beginning. They hired 2 teachers who were themselves disabled musicians, bringing expertise the faculty had never had. They created partnerships with schools for blind and deaf students, offering workshops and summer programs. The Thomas Richter Memorial Fund grew large enough to support 10 full scholarships every year, and Elena thrived. Not just in her studies, though her talent continued to amaze everyone who heard her play. She thrived in other ways too. She started a student organization for disabled musicians. She spoke at conferences about accessible music education, and she challenged Wagner constantly, pushing him to think differently about disability, about accommodation, about what it meant to truly include everyone. Their relationship became something neither had expected. Yes, Wagner was her teacher, guiding her through advanced techniques in music theory. But she taught him too. She taught him to question assumptions he didn't even know he was making, to listen more carefully, to understand that accessibility wasn't about lowering standards but about removing barriers that never should have existed in the first place. One evening in Elena's third year, Wagner sat in the audience for her annual recital. She'd grown so much since that first audition. Taller, more confident, more assured in her abilities. She walked onto the stage without her mother's help now, using her cane with practiced ease. She sat at the piano and adjusted the bench, then turned toward the audience. "Tonight I'd like to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, she announced. "This piece holds special meaning for me. It was the first thing I played at this conservatory, and it taught me that sometimes we have to play through our fear to get to the truth on the other side." She began to play, and Wagner felt the same awe he'd felt 3 years ago. But this time there was something else mixed in. Pride. Not the self-congratulatory kind that comes from taking credit for someone else's accomplishments, but the quiet pride of knowing he'd helped create a space where Elena could flourish, where any talented student, regardless of disability, could flourish. When the piece ended and the audience erupted in applause, Elena stood and bowed. Then she did something unexpected. She turned toward where Wagner sat in the third row and bowed again, specifically to him. Wagner's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't bring Thomas back. He couldn't erase the past or undo the harm he'd caused. But he could do this. He could be better. He could help create the opportunities that Thomas never got. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. After the recital, Elena found Wagner in the hallway. "Thank you for coming, Maestro." "Elena, you don't need to thank me. Your playing was extraordinary as always." She smiled. "I wasn't thanking you for coming to the recital. I was thanking you for letting me teach you. Not every teacher is brave enough to learn from their students." Wagner thought about that. About how he'd spent 40 years thinking he had all the answers. About how one blindfolded girl had shown him that the most important lessons come from the people we almost dismiss, from the voices we almost silence, from the students who see the world differently and by seeing differently, help us see it more clearly. "I think," Wagner said slowly, "that the best teachers are always learning. And you, Elena, are an excellent teacher." She laughed. "I'm a pretty good piano player too." "Yes," Wagner agreed, genuine warmth in his voice. "Yes, you are." They walked down the hallway together, teacher and student, both changed by their unlikely friendship. Behind them, the practice rooms hummed with music. Students of all abilities, all backgrounds, all dreams, working toward excellence together. And somewhere in that beautiful noise, Wagner could almost hear another sound. A violin, playing something he'd never gotten to hear. Playing the music that Thomas Richter never got the chance to share with the world. But playing now, finally, in the space they'd created together. In the second chance that came 30 years too late for one young man, but just in time for countless others.